Local authorities should make greater use of religious charities to deliver welfare, so says the think tank Demos, which has just produced a report on the matter. Jonathan Birdwell is the author, and we're also joined by Andrew Copson, who's the Chief Executive of the British Humanist Association. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Jonathan Birdwell, your report is called Faithful Providers. What did you set out to establish?
Well, this government, as part of its public service reforms, wants to see a wide range of different organisations providing public services. And one thing that we wanted to look at was how effective were faith groups at doing this? Were they particularly effective in some areas? What were the challenges involved with faith groups delivering services? And what we found was that they actually could be highly effective. They were very motivated to deliver services and to help those in need. We saw no evidence of kind of aggressive preaching or discrimination towards service users, which is often the criticisms that are leveled at faith-based providers. And yet they're not being fully integrated into the government's work program and drug strategy and other types of public service reforms.
And before I put that to Andrew Copson, just clear up one point. Do you see a direct connection between the religious character of these organisations and their ability to deliver welfare?
We would say yes, to some extent. We saw faith was very apparent in the language of motivation. People often cited their responsibility they felt, the duty they had to actually work tirelessly, to work long hours for little pay, because they cared so much about helping those in need. So we would say that there does appear to be a connection between the faith and the motivation, and then thus to provide effective services.
Andrew Copson, you take issue with all this, I think.
Yeah, I think in particular, to pick up on two of the things we've just heard, this point about there being no evidence of discrimination or proselytising, I find that very difficult to believe, and I almost want to ask what evidence was actually looked for, because one of the things that seems to be entirely absent from the report is any sort of thorough survey of the service users' perspective in these organisations that are looked at. There's a list of 20 organisations that are held up as exemplars. Just looking at that list last week, I could see immediately 3 organisations that I know have had reported terrible cases of bullying and harassment and discrimination and proselytising that we've heard of from service user complaints alone at the BHA. So I think we really need to look carefully at service users' experience, not just ask organisations, do you think that you're doing a really good job? Are you really well motivated?
Well, that's a fair point.
So that's the first... Oh, sorry.
Well, we'll come to the others in a moment. Let's
Okay.
do it as we go. Jonathan Birdwell, would you like to deal with that? Because that's an important point.
Yeah, I think that is an important point, and I completely agree. And I think, obviously the views of service users should be reflected. And if there are any issues, then local authorities need to take that into account. But what we saw was that commissioners of public services, we think, are excessively squeamish about employing faith-based groups because there's a kind of prejudice against faith-based groups. And what we saw over the whole was that many of them were very aware of not preaching, particularly to those who were in vulnerable positions. So I think, of course, you're going to find some bad examples or some examples of faith groups doing that, but I think we can't tar all faith groups with that brush.
But that's just what they say, isn't it? I mean, this report is only based on what they say, what the organisations themselves say. So, of course, they're going to say, no, we don't proselytise, no, we don't, try to force our...
Well, I suspect we probably aren't going to reach a consensus on that point. Andrew Copson, perhaps you could also deal with Jonathan Birdwell's argument that the people who deliver these services through faith groups are likely to be well motivated, likely to have altruistic motives for what they're doing, and that makes them better at it.
Well, I think most people are well-intentioned. I'd like to think it. I think it's probably true that most people are well-intentioned in the work they set out to do. I think it's a second big gap in this report is that it compares religious organisations and the motivations of religious organisations with, for example, the private sector, and says, look at religious people, they're really high-minded, they're really well-motivated, they have intrinsic selfless motivation. But the private sector is not the right comparator for religious organisations. The right comparator is the rest of the voluntary and charitable sector. 2/3 of our voluntary and charitable sector is secular. And I think it's wrong to say, one of the things this report does is it doesn't see the wood for the trees. It focuses on a very small part of the voluntary sector, religious organisations, and makes claims about it which actually are applicable to the whole wide range of people doing good in our society, including non-religious
Jonathan,
people.
but we haven't got very long. I just want to ask you about a slightly different point that arises from all this. Do you think, from the perspective of the religious organisations involved, there's a danger that they essentially become implementers of the government's policy if they get very deeply involved in delivering welfare in this way?
I do think there's a risk of that, and I think no one's forcing faith groups to become involved in delivering services. I mean, if those who want to be involved, they can be involved. And I think we argue in the report as well that, faith groups should shift to kind of focusing on the bigger issues, advocates for kind of justice and other social justice points. But I think the interesting thing is that often faith groups are working in areas that progressives and those on the left, who are often the most vocal critics of faith groups, that they're working on the same issues that they share concern over.
That's an interesting point, Andrew Copson. Would you just like to respond to that there's a mutual suspicion there which isn't perhaps necessary?
Well, I think it is necessary to some extent. I'd like to say, I don't think anyone has a problem with religious organisations self-organising and motivated people doing good in the community with their own resources. I think that's fine. No one, to my knowledge, has ever objected to religious groups doing that. What I object to, and what many people object to, is public services, statutory public services, which have previously been secular and open to all people and provided in an objective way, then being provided by religious organisations that have legal rights to discriminate.
We could go on for some time, but sadly we run out of time. Andrew Copson, Jonathan Birdwell, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.